Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Fischer. I'm going to talk about, I'm from New York, and really great to be here. I'm going to talk about these thing I created called like Science GPT. So the idea is like, how could we make like AI be like a research assistant to like a scientist? And what does it look like when a scientist is sort of augmented with AI? And then also like, how do we use like D-side technologies to try and make that all work? So this was like sort of like a toy project I built. Okay, yeah. So the goals is like, I think it's important because we keep trying to think of ways to like create different mechanisms for scientists to, fix the reproducibility problem in science and to make science more reproducible and the methods more rigorous. And we keep trying to do that maybe with like incremental technologies in terms of like data sharing and but I was trying to like rethink it, like what if the problem in science isn't necessarily like, maybe the problem in science is the humans that are doing it, and maybe if we were able to like put in a little bit more AI into it, we could make science a lot better. So this is like a proof of concept of how. Then there's just this other thing also. It's like, okay, so if you have AI that's only AI, it can't really interact with the real world at all. So an AI model, if you ask it to like measure the temperature outside or to conduct an experiment in its current instantiation, it can't really like interface with the real world. So part of this experiment with like creating an AI scientist is thinking through like, how do we create an AI that's able to like interface with the real world as well? Because currently it's just sort of all in its own virtual world, and that's typically not how science is done. I mean, you can do science that way for like mathematics, but you can't do science that way for like real world science. Okay, let's go to the next one. So like, let's just break down like what's included in science. So science typically involves like a research question first, and then a hypothesis and a experiment. And then you take that experiment and you analyze it. And this is sort of like the scientific method that is very common, and you come up with a conclusion. So what we're going to do is we're going to try and make AI, like ChatGPT, do each one of these different parts of the process that is typically done with a human. So this is a little small, but I'll just read it. This is the first thing is like, we first have to make it come up with a question. So we say like, okay, ChatGPT, what are the main areas of science? So this was just sort of like an ideation phase. And it comes back with the main areas of science are physics, the main areas of science are chemistry, the main areas of science are biology, earth science, astronomy, environmental science, computer science, psychology, sociology, and medicine. So now we say we need to get a little bit more specific. So because this is like an easy project, I wanted to do it on like I wanted this science project to be reproducible by anyone. So I thought like, what is something that everyone has access to? And people have access to like baking soda and vinegar, which is for making a volcano. So I say like, for each of the fields of science, come up with a research question about baking soda and vinegar volcanoes. So the first one is physics, and it says, how do you rate the eruption in a baking soda and vinegar volcano, and how does it relate to the ratio of baking soda and vinegar to the temperature of the vinegar? And then in chemistry, it says, how does the acidity level of the vinegar affect the chemical reaction between baking soda and vinegar in a volcano? And then for biology, it says, how does the presence of yeast in baking soda and vinegar volcano affect the rate of eruption and the formation of bubbles? So for each of the different areas that we had written out before, it came up with like a science experiment for each of those different ones. Okay, so then we have to have like, those in the previous things, those were the research questions. So now I asked, it said, for each of these different research questions, come up with a hypothesis, because like generating a hypothesis is very important in the scientific process, because otherwise you need some sort of guess. Otherwise you sort of p-value hacking, or you'll just find inference, you'll find causality where there maybe isn't. Okay, so for physics, it says the rate of eruption in a baking soda and vinegar volcano will increase as the ratio of baking soda to the vinegar increases and the temperature increases. And then for chemistry, it says the acidity level of the vinegar will affect the chemical reaction between baking soda and vinegar in a volcano, with higher acidity levels resulting in a stronger eruption. So for each of those, it sort of came up with one of those. We'll go to the next slide. Oh, so I said, let's just do the chemistry one. It was just sort of chose randomly, but you could do any of them. And it said, now we need to come up with, okay, so it has this question, it has this hypothesis, so we have to come up with a methodology for doing this. So it says, to test, we say for chemistry, it says, come up with a methodology for this experiment, we asked it, and it said, okay, to test the hypothesis that the acidity level of vinegar affects the chemical reaction between baking soda and vinegar in a volcano, the following methodology can be used. You gather the material, you prepare the volcano model, you measure the acidity level of the vinegar, and it basically wrote out like a methods that you'd normally read about in a paper, and it says, test different acidity levels, perform the volcano eruption using acidity levels of 3, 5, and 7%. So that's pretty cool. Okay, so then I wanted to be a little bit more specific, since I wanted to create a form that anybody could figure out. So they could basically like conduct the experiment and then fill out like a form where you just like type it in, and then it would just like collect all of this data in a database, and then we'd have the like AI analyze that. So it came up with this this form. Okay, so this is actually pretty interesting too. This is like, it's done a lot of like, I started this company called DAO, which is like a Google Forms for like Web3. And so the idea here is like, we need to get the questions that it created previously in a format that could be put into this form. So I just gave it an example of like the JSON schema that we need. And then I gave it the questions we wanted, and it was able to marshal the data between the questions that we had before and into the format that DBDAO needs to read it out. All right, next slide. So this is the form that's created here. So you can see you have the acidity level, and it just created this whole form that is the whole schema, like for a database schema, more or less. So now we have this form that we have, and we can send it out to all the people in our DAO. So let's say we created like a volcano DAO to test out volcano experiments. Okay, so now we did the first experiment here. So we got baking soda and vinegar. So I think you can press play, and it should play the video. So this is like the first ever DSci volcano experiment. So it worked. Okay, so now we fill out the form here of like the acidity level, the ratio of baking soda to vinegar, the strength of how much it erupted, how long it lasted for. And it's all in this database. And what's cool about this database, you can go to the next slide. What's cool about this database that's created is it's actually the data point that we created for that point is actually an NFT. So inside that data point is like a JSON object that is, and this is like what DBDAO does, is like it's a database that's sort of composed of NFTs. And so you can buy this data point on OpenSea. It's basically stored on IPFS and Avalanche, so it's all on the blockchain. And what's cool is like, say this data point is worth a lot of money, like people can actually buy and sell individual data points. So here's the data point. You can see this is actually stored on IPFS, so it's very easy to access. And here's the here's it on Arbitrum, the transaction for it. Okay, so now we have the data points that are in our data set, and we export them from Arweave and from DBDAO back into a CSV file that we ask it to analyze the data for. So we just like tell it, okay, here's the data you gave us, analyze it. and it writes up this whole research report around the methods and the result and the conclusion, the recommendations, and the future work, which is kind of cool. Oh, okay. I also run DSci NYC, so you guys are all invited to our next event. You can next slide. Yeah. Here's my Telegram in case anyone has any other questions. Here's about DSci NYC, and here's about DB DAO here. And yeah, feel free to take a picture. Does anyone have any questions? Questions? No? Okay. Oh yeah, do you have a question?
Tell us some funny things that happen using the system.
Funny things that happened. I mean,
when it's totally wrong, for instance.
It got it. It was pretty accurate because, I mean, I didn't. It got it pretty well actually. This was using 3.5 GPT 3.5. This wasn't even using 4. So I'd imagine 4 would probably even be better. But I was actually surprised at how well it worked. I mean, this is a pretty basic thing, but to be honest with you, I think it could work well for many types of scientific applications. Like the likelihood that a human can do a literature review better than AI is fairly low. The likelihood that like an AI can generate a methods that's more accurate or is probably also fairly low. So I would say I'm pretty optimistic that this is probably a way forward for science in general. And yeah, and I think it's interesting because it removes a lot of the bias. It removes a lot of the ego that I think like PhD professor, anyone in academia might have if it's just sort of offloading it onto the AI. And it also makes it more reproducible. Like the steps that it gave aren't meant to only work in one lab. Like the whole idea about sending this form out to many people was that like, okay, now you need reproducibility across like 3, 4, 10 labs, and now you have more certainty that the results are correct. All right. Well, thank you guys.